All right, we're ready for Ezekiel chapters 42 to 44. We're quickly bringing Ezekiel to a close. The end of this month, we'll be through with Ezekiel, ready to shift gears to another trimester, another book. So we're toward the end of Ezekiel. This is in the final section of the book of Ezekiel, three major sections. There is the judgment on Jerusalem. There's the nations section we've been talking about. And we're in this section on restoration of God's people. And in that, we've been talking about the return to their land. And then we've talked about the new life in unity, that is the valley of dry bones, demonstrating God can bring them back to life. And he would when he brings them back into the land. And then they'll be protected from their enemies. There was the defeat of Gog, of Magog. And now we're in the section, worship the Lord acceptably, as one writer puts it. And we'll talk more about what that is all about here in a second. So that's where we are. Now, in this section under the restoration, we are in this worship the Lord acceptably. And last week we talked about an alternative title to that section may be the vision of the restoration of the homeland. And as in the other prophets, such as Isaiah or Jeremiah or whoever it may be, there's often the promise of coming back into the land, the restoration, the remnant coming back in the post-exile period, blended with the promise of the Messiah. And we have that here. And this is heavily messianic, and we're going to see that as we go a little bit further. There is this section that we began last time called the New Temple. And what we saw in chapters 40 and 41, it was the two chapters we noted. We studied more than that, but we studied in this section, 40 and 41 last time. And here's what we saw. And if you weren't here last time, you might back up to chapter 40 and notice at verse 2 that this is a vision. And so, lest we get into our study tonight, and you weren't here last week, and you say, well, this is not really making sense to me. This is a vision. This is the third vision of the book. There was one in chapters 1 to 3, one in 8 through 11, and then this one starts here through the end of the book. So this is a vision that he sees. And God allows him to see a vision. We'll see more about the purpose of this vision a little bit later in our study in chapter 43 tonight. But this is a vision of a new temple. We'll say more about the significance of all of that here in a second. But Ezekiel is shown a new order by means of a vision. And he sees a description of the boundaries of the temple and the temple compound and the walls and the outer court and the inner court and its gateways. And then he starts being shown the temple itself. And we saw that in chapter 40 on through chapter 41, the side chambers and the porches and the buildings in the back, etc., all of that. Now what we're going to see next is, in chapter 42, we're going to see the priest chambers in the temple yard. We'll get the details of that later, so don't worry about that. Then we're going to see the returning of the glory of the Lord to the temple. Remember, the glory of the Lord left, chapters 8 through 11. And then we're going to see the altar of burnt offerings. That's three things in chapters 42 and 43. Now there's 44 to go. We're going to get that too. But those are the three things we're going to focus on here in just a second. Now let's review what we talked about last time, and I don't apologize for repeating this. If you weren't here, you need to see this. If you were here, we need to be reminded of this. This whole section must be symbolic and figurative and cannot be literal for the following reasons. That is, if we take this building of this temple and worship in this temple, having reference to a literal temple to be built, the premillennialists think so. Some of the Jews think so, that it's yet to be future. This is literally going to be built. Then we have some problems. Because David is going to be the king at this time. David is dead. So is David going to be raised literally and then he's going to be the king? Well, you say, well, no, that's not talking about David literally. All right, that's my point. It's not literal. It's figurative, it's symbolic. They're going to dwell in the land forever. The use of the term seven, the number seven, which is often used in apocalyptic literature. There's no temple ever been built that fits this description. We'll make this point a little bit later, so you don't have to worry about writing this down. But this was 6 times the size of Solomon's temple. So this was a humongous temple. No temple has ever been built that fits this description. The animal sacrifices are going to be restored. Circumcision would be binding, chapter 44. God dwells in the temple forever. The measuring of the new temple causes shame. If it's a literal temple, it ought to cause the idea of glory to be extolled because of this temple being built. Only those of the lineage of Zadok could offer the sacrifices. The sacrifices don't harmonize with the Old Testament, so it wouldn't fit that period. There's a literal river, if this is literal, flowing from the temple in chapter 47. So for those reasons, we say that this has to be symbolic and figurative. So what's the point? I repeat these quotes from last time. McGuigan said, understand it simply as a picture of the glory for the Jew under the Messiah without descending into details, making those details allegorical. In other words, we're not going to take each thing and say, well, this gate represents, and this chamber represents, and this court represents. We cannot do that because that would all be a matter of guesswork, as we mentioned last time. McGuigan goes on to say that I believe that Ezekiel is now telling the beaten Jew that the day was coming when they would enjoy prosperity and glory under the Lord, and that he described it in terms with which they were altogether familiar. Now, there's a reason for that. We're going to see that a little bit later, and I'm going to give you the verse on that here in a second. Harkrider said, therefore, in the entire vision Ezekiel portrays in these closing chapters is symbolic of the gospel age and the spiritual temple, which is the church of our Lord. You live to see this day. You've seen this temple. You're one of the priests serving in this temple that is being described here in these chapters. Again, a quote from Harkrider. So now in this section, Ezekiel describes the new kingdom of God, which is born out of the throes of all the suffering they had endured. That's often the tactic of the prophets. A new Jerusalem, a new temple, and a new order of worship will be instituted. He uses language with which the Jewish mind is familiar, making the same point we saw a moment ago. But in apocalyptic style, he symbolizes the new spiritual Jerusalem, which is holy and must be kept that way. We see that in chapter 43. And it will be strong to resist any onslaught that can be brought against it, chapters 38 and 39, I might add. So why so many details if it's symbolic? Well, we saw this quotation last time, and I've added this verse to that. You might turn over there. McGuigan said the people are being called to holiness, the like of which they have not been practicing. The very structure of the temple is calling them to that, and that's why the prophet was going into so many details with regard to the measurement of the temple. Well, let's jump ahead of ourselves. Look at chapter 43 and 10. That God told Ezekiel, son of man, describe the temple to the house of Israel, that they may be ashamed. So why so many details? Instead of just saying, there's going to be a wonderful temple in the future under the Messiah, and this is all spiritual. Why did he need to say that in about 2 sentences instead of all these chapters? Why so many details about the chambers and then the gates and the inner court and the outer court and the 3 stories of the chambers for the priest, etc., and all these details? Perhaps those details, chapter 3 and in verse 10, was so that they could compare that to their failure, the glories of this description, to their failure to cause them to come to shame. Now, we'll say more about that at chapter 43 and verse 10 in a moment. So you're looking for this in your outline. Let's summarize what we're going to see in 42, 43, and 44. So in 42, what we're going to see is the priest's chambers. He describes it as if it is a literal temple, and we'll talk about it from that vantage point, but it's spiritual in its application, and we're going to get that perhaps even clearer when we get through. Then the second thing we see in 42 are the total dimensions of the temple compound, the enormous size of that, and that's given in chapter 42. So if we see those 2 things in 42, we've seen the picture of 42. 3 things we're going to see in 43. The glory of God returns. Remember, the glory departed, chapters 8 through 11. We'll give some references to that in a moment. And then we'll see the purpose of this description. We just talked about that at verse 10. Why the details? Here it is, verse 10. And then there's the altar that's described and what's being done concerning that altar. Chapter 44 talks about those that are allowed in the temple and the regulation of the Levites who serve. Some would not be allowed. Others would be allowed to sacrifice. The gates are shut. That symbolizes something. Let's see what that is all about when we get to 44. So that's what chapters 42 to 44 are about. So let's talk now about the priest chambers in the temple yard in chapters 42, verses 1 to 14. What about the temple chambers around the temple yard that is being described in 1 to 14? Now, we looked at an artist depiction of the temple itself. And this is from Logos Bible software. And some of their comments show premillennial concepts that they have, but their drawing is pretty good. And I want to zoom in just a little bit and notice that what we're talking about are these areas here. There's one on either side of the temple, one on the north side up here, and this is the south side that's being described. So let's go through verses 1 to 14 and we'll talk about that. Another artist rendering of that, if we might zoom in a little bit on that one, is kind of a footprint of that, and is right here. These chambers that have a hallway between them, and it can be entered from either end, and these are the chambers for the priest. Now this is a literal drawing, as if this were a literal temple. But let's back up now to this one right here, and let's work our way through 1 to 14. Now at verse 1, he describes, he brought me to the outer court on the north side. So he's on the far side from the temple that you see right here in the vision. And we're not going to read every verse of this, but notice that he talked in verse 3 about there was gallery against gallery in 3 stories. So these chambers, as you see here, are in 3 stories. Then notice at verse 5, the upper chambers were shorter. And verse 6 says they were shortened more than the lower and the middle levels. In other words, the lower level is for lack of a better description, is wider, and then the next level is even less, and then the top level is less. So it goes in stair steps, as depicted here in this picture. And then notice at verse 11. You want to take note of this. You're looking for this in your handout, but this is a significant point at verse 11. There's several times we see something like this that we want to call attention to. And that is, let's read verse 11. And there was a walk in the front of them, and the appearance like the chambers. They were toward the north, and they were as long and as wide as the others. And all the exit and entrance were according to, here's your word you want to underline, plan. God had a plan for this temple. God always has a plan for his temples, his tabernacles, his church. All things are to be according to the pattern. Hebrews chapter 8 and in verse 5. There's a plan for this. We're going to see more about the plan here in just a moment. Then he turns and talks about the north and the south. And notice what these chambers were for at verse 13. These were holy chambers where the priest who approach the Lord shall eat the most holy offerings. All right, we'll say more about that in just a moment. Now at verse 14, when the priest enter them, they do not go out of the holy chamber into the outer court, but they leave their garments in which they minister, for they are holy. In other words, the holy garments are to be left there. They're not to go out into the public. They're not to go out to minister to others with those holy garments. And here's a lesson I'm learning from that. I learned something about the seriousness of approaching God. When we're approaching God, there's a degree of seriousness and reverence and humility should be involved. The priest is described here, though I know this is spiritual, talking about the church of our Lord, but that's us. That there ought to be a level of reverence in approaching God. There should not be irreverence. There should not be casuality. These priests come before the Lord, and they were to approach him. Notice at verse 13 again. They shall eat the most holy offerings. What's the word I'm looking for? As they talks about these are the holy chambers of those who approach the Lord. They were to dress holy, and they were to leave those garments there because what they did there was not the same thing they did elsewhere. Approaching the Lord is serious matters, is what I'm trying to get you to see. All right, that's verses 1 to 14. That was a description in his vision of these chambers for the priest. Now let's go further and talk about the total dimensions around the temple area, verses 15 to 20. Some approach this as if this is the measurement of the inner court. Well, the inner court has already been measured, chapters 40 and 41. So has the temple itself been measured, chapter 40. The outer court has been measured, but I take it that this is a description of the total compound, all the way around this compound in this vision. This was the measurement. Now, it's quite enormous. So let's see what it's talking about. Remember, we read about a rod beginning in chapter 40. And a rod was 6 cubits. Well, if you take a rod being 6 cubits, that means that, and make it 18 inches is a cubic. For some measure by 18, some say it's 21. If it's 18 inches, that would be 9 feet for the rod. Or if it's the 21 inches, that would be 10 foot 6 inches. So keep that in mind, that what a rod is. Now let's see what the measurement was. that he measured the east side with the measuring rod, 500 rods by the measuring rod all around. He measured the north side 500 rods by the measurement of the rod all around, and he measured the south side 500 rods, and on the west 500 rods, and on down the line. In other words, in every direction it was 500 rods. Well, that comes to, if it's and most lean toward the 21, though I've always leaned toward 18 inches per cubic. But let's go with the 21. That's 5,250 feet. That's enormous. That's too big, far too big, to be built in the spot where Solomon's temple was. If the premillennialists want to rebuild this temple, if they're going to build it according to the plan, it's not going to fit. It doesn't work. This is a vision, and this is a vision of something yet in the future that's spiritual from the standpoint of the prophet. Now, this took up 6 times the space of Solomon's temple. So no wonder when we get to chapter 43 that there is this great shame, because it's describing something glorious, far more glorious than they had ever experienced, and that they had abused and that they had misused. Now, to give you some idea of and I don't want to spend much time on this, this is Logos software, but if you noticed right here, and I'll have another comparison like this, this little rectangle down here at the bottom is the size of a football field in comparison to the temple compound. This again, I think, is from Logos. Here is Ezekiel's temple described over here, though I think their numbers are a little bit wrong here. But here is a football field. This is Solomon's temple. This is the court of the tabernacle. This would be Herod's temple. Far more enormous. Another comparison of the same kinds of things from the football field to Ezekiel's temple, to Herod's temple, to Solomon's temple, etc. This was enormous. But that was the size of this temple in his vision. Now, let's talk about the glory of the Lord coming back to this. Remember now, this is in a vision. So what he saw in this vision, he saw the chambers for the priest, and he saw the measuring of the whole compound, and it's enormous. That's all I want to see. All we need to see at this point to get the idea. So let's talk about the returning of the glory of the Lord, verses 1 to 12. Now, you're looking for this in your handout, so let's back up to chapter 8. I want to look at 3 references where the glory of the Lord left. Let's go back to chapter 8, chapters 8 through 11. But let's start with chapter 8 and in verse 6. Chapter 8 and in verse 6 is the first of the 3 references that, do you see what they are doing? The great abominations in the house of Israel, to make me go far away from my sanctuary. God said, I'm going to leave my sanctuary. Let's go to chapter 10 now. And notice at verse 18 beginning, the glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple and stood over the cherubim. That continues on down to about verse 22. But the glory of the Lord departed from the temple. Why? Because of the abominations of what they were doing and the sin that was involved. The third reference would be chapter 11. And notice at verse 22, the cherubim lifted up its wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the Lord was high above them, and the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain which is by the east side of the city. So the glory of the Lord departed in those 3 references. If you didn't get that, that's chapter 8 and 6, 10 and 18 and 11 and verse 22. So the glory of the Lord has departed. Now notice at verse 2, he said, afterward he brought me, verse 1, brought me to the gate that faces toward the east. Here's what he saw. You might underline it, verse 2. The glory of the God of Israel came from the way of the east. And so if you say, well, how do you see the glory of the Lord? This is a vision. Anything's possible in a vision. So he saw in the vision the glory of the Lord coming back to enter this temple. Let's drop down to verse 4. You might underline again. And the glory of God came into the temple. The same glory that left earlier because of sin is now coming back because of the glory of this temple. Look at verse 5. The glory of the Lord filled the temple. And the Lord promised at verse 7 he was going to dwell in this temple forever. In other words, I'm not leaving this temple like I did that temple. I'm going to dwell in this one forever. Now notice, no more shall the house of Israel defile my holy name, they nor their kings by their harlotry, and the carcasses of their kings on the high places. In other words, they're not going to ever do that again. Well, in the post-exile period, they didn't serve idolatry as a whole, like we talked about. That's not what he was talking about. I think he's saying they're not going to defile. This kingdom and this temple is going to be purified. Things are going to be pure in contrast to the debauchery that we saw before. It's interesting here at verse 8. They defile, I'm reading at the middle of verse 8, they defile my holy name by the abominations which they committed, therefore I have consumed them in my anger. And so God said, my glory left because of my anger at their sin. But he says that he's coming back and bringing the glory back. Now there's some practical things I want to get to before we leave this. But here's one of the practical things I'm learning from this chapter. The same God that gets angry is the same God that restores. And some people focus on the anger of God. Well, that same God that's angry at sin is the same God that opens his arms and embraces when people turn back. And some only want to focus on the God that embraces. Well, that same God that embraces is the same God that got angry. And so if your God is a loving God and he's the God of heaven, he's also an angry God. And if your God's an angry God, he's also a loving God. And I see that balance here in chapter 43. Now, verse 10 is interesting. Let's stop and talk about verse 10. He said, Son of man, describe the temple to the house of Israel that they may be ashamed of their iniquities and let them measure the pattern. Let's start at the end of the verse. Here we see the pattern, the plan, verse 11. Here we see a pattern. We're going to see the law of the temple at verse 12. Those three expressions describe God has a plan, God has a pattern, God has a law. Now, that's what they had ignored. And that's why they got in the condition they were. But let's go back to verse 10. Describe the temple of the house of Israel that they may be ashamed. When they see the contrast of this glorious temple in contrast to their failure, that's going to cause them to be ashamed when they compare their failure to the new temple. And that was the purpose of all the details. So you say, I'm still kind of puzzled. I don't understand. Why did God write all this? And it's kind of hard to follow and understand. And I don't get all of this thing about the temple beginning at chapter 40 to 40. I get lost. And why so many details? This was given to Israel so that when they read it and they understood it and Ezekiel explained it, it causes them to be ashamed. Here's a footnote and a practical lesson from verse 10. Not all of the preaching and teaching of the word makes you feel better. That's an interesting point, isn't it? How many times do you think, boy, I hope this class makes me feel good. I hope this sermon makes me feel better about myself. And isn't it wonderful when you go hear a sermon and you walk away thinking, you know what? I feel better about myself. I feel pretty good about myself. I feel real good. Same thing in reading a text. Not all preaching, not all teaching, not all classes, not all revelation makes me feel better. Sometimes it makes me ashamed. Sometimes it makes me feel worse. That was the purpose of this, he said. Now, if they're ashamed of what they have done, verse 11 I'm reading, make known to them the design of the temple and its arrangements, its exits, its entrance, its entire design. Tell them all the details. And all of its laws, and write it down in their sight, so they may keep the whole design and its ordinances and perform them. This is the law of the temple. The whole area surrounding the mountaintop shall be most holy. Behold, this is the law of the temple. This is it. And that's the end of the description here of the glory of the Lord entering the temple. So there's really three things in this chapter. We've outlined it here as two. But there's the glory of the Lord entering the temple. Here's the purpose of the description and what it was about. And then now we're ready for the altar of the burnt offering, beginning at 43 and continuing at verse 13, continuing through verse 27. Now what is that altar burnt offering? We'll see the description of it and then the consecration. Let's start with the description of it. Let's zoom in again. And that's talking about this altar right here. That's in front of the temple, that altar of burnt offerings. And so, because this is a vision and it's as if he were seeing a literal temple, in the vision he sees this altar. So let's see its description. We won't spend much time there. These are the measurements of the altar in cubits. There was The cubit is 1 cubit and a handbreadth, and the base of it was a cubit high and a cubit wide, and the rim all around of the edge was 1 span. And the height of the altar, and I'm skipping down to verse 15, the altar hearth was 4 cubits high with the 4 horns extending upward from the hearth. The altar is 12 cubits long and 12 wide and 12 and square in its 4 corners, etc. And so when you get through with that tomorrow, you won't remember the details of the size of that. So I'm not focused on that. But I am interested in this right here, and that is the consecration of the altar. So he sees in this vision this altar. It's enormous because everything else is enormous. Now, beginning at verse 18, there are 2 things I want you to focus on, and I think we're asking for 2 things in your handout here. And what did the sacrifices on the altar accomplish? There's 2 things we want to see here. He said, Son of man, I'm reading at verse 18, these are the ordinances for the altar on the day in which it's made, and the sacrificing of burnt offerings. And you'd offer a young bull. Now, again, if this is literal to be built, if Jesus is coming back and they're going to build this, then the bulls are going to be offered, animal sacrifices are going to be reinstituted. When they've been done away and there's a better sacrifice, the blood of Christ, we're going to go back to animal sacrifices? Is that it? That don't make sense to me. But let's look at verse 19. You're going to give a young bull for a sin offering. I don't want us to get bogged down and focus just on, okay, was it a bull first and then a lamb or a ram or what is it? But there was a bull to be offered. On the 2nd day, verse 22, a kid of goats was to be offered without blemish. Verse 23, then a bull would be offered after you finish cleansing it. Offer a young bull without blemish. Then drop down to verse 25. For every day for 7 days you shall prepare a goat for a sin offering. You also prepare a bull, young bull, and a ram. And 7 days you shall make atonement, reading at verse 26, for the altar to purify it and to consecrate it. So here's number 1. What's accomplished by these sacrifices? It's consecrating, as we put here, the consecration of the altar. The altar has been consecrated. But there's something else that's going to be accomplished. Look at verse 27. When these days are over, when the days are over, it shall be the 8th day, and thereafter the priest shall offer your burnt offerings and your peace offerings on the altar. You might underline, and I will accept you, says the Lord God. And so when this altar is consecrated, then your sacrifices are acceptable and I accept you. Now, God had rejected his people because of their sin. That's what the whole book is about. Now he's talking about when they would be accepted. This is talking about the day of the Messiah. You say, boy, I would love to hear that word, I accept you. If you're a Christian, that's what he said to you. If you obeyed the gospel and the blood of Christ was shed and you contacted the blood of Christ through obedience to the gospel, that's what God said to you. He said, I accept you. You say, I'd love to hear him say. He did say that to you. You're a Christian. And so there's some practical things to learn from that. There's no more important words to hear from God than I will accept you. The worst words you can ever hear from God is, depart from me, I never knew you. But I accept you, whether he says that now in accepting you in the kingdom, or he says that to you in the day of judgment, accepting you into heaven. There's no greater words you can hear from the Lord than, I will accept you. Now, what a contrast. You think of the Jew hearing this description. As Ezekiel's explaining it to them, they think, you know what? We kept hearing from Ezekiel, God has rejected you. God has rejected you. God has rejected you. No wonder they were ashamed. No wonder they cried. No wonder there's problems. Anyway, interesting point. I will accept you. Now, that's the 2 things that are accomplished. The consecration of the altar, and then the people are accepted by God. Those are the 2 things that are accomplished. All right, now let's go to chapter 44. We're shifting gears a little bit. Chapters 40 to 43 talks about the new temple. Then 44 through 46, we're only going to 44, 45 and 46 next time, are the regulations concerning the new worship, the period of worship, and so on down the line. I want us to get through chapter 44, and then you have a spot on your outline, or on your handout, about God's holy temple. I want to list some things, some practical things, 5 things we want to have time toward the end to work through from Homer Haley on that. He's had some excellent points. You've seen that before. I've published that several times in bulletins and workbooks and so forth. It's an interesting 5 points concerning this temple. But anyway, let's talk about chapter 44 concerning the regulations of the temple. Here's what we see in 44, 2 major thoughts. There's the positions assigned for those who will be allowed in the temple. Now again, this is a vision he's seeing in the temple. But it's sending a message about the temple of God, the kingdom of God in the Messianic age. Then there is the regulation for the priest of the Lord who will serve. So let's talk about the position assigned to those who will be allowed in the temple. Let's start at verse 2, or back up to verse 1. That he brought me back to the outer court of the sanctuary, which faces toward the east, but it was shut. And the Lord said to me, this gate shall be shut, shall not be open, no man shall enter by it. Now, he's going to go further, talking about who's allowed in chapter 44. The prince, no foreigner. Here's the priest. Here's those that are accepted, etc. So I think there's a significant point. I don't think we can take every single point of this vision and say, here's a parallel to that. But I ask a question in your handout, what does the gate being shut suggest? And it suggests that not anybody and everybody just walks into the kingdom. If this whole picture is a picture of the Messianic age, and by not anybody, God will welcome anybody that comes in through obedience, but not everybody's allowed in. The foreigner's not allowed in. He has to be a convert. The sinner's not allowed in. He has to be changed, has to be cleansed, so that God said, I will accept you. The sacrifice has to be offered, etc. But I think that's a significant point to learn from that the gate is shut and you can't enter. Not everybody's allowed in. You the door's not open for everybody to come in. Not in this kingdom. Only certain people. We see that in the Sermon on the Mount, by the way. All right. Now let's talk about the prince. He says at verse 3, as for the prince, because he is the prince, he may sit in it and eat bread before the Lord, and he may enter by the way of the vestibule of the gateway and go out the same way. What's it talking about? Well, the best answer to give to that, I think, is I don't know. But chapter 34, I raised this question. In chapter 34, verse 24, and I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David, a prince among them. See, David was mentioned as a prince, but we know that wasn't literally David, because this is talking about the Messianic age. That must be the Messiah. So is that descriptive of the Messiah? Perhaps so. I want to think he's talking about the Messiah here. So the Messiah is in this temple. I don't know what else to make of that. I'm going to leave that because I don't know what else to say. As a friend of mine says, I made up part of that to tell you that much. I don't know what else to say about the prince. Now, verses 4 to 9, foreigners will be excluded. We won't spend much time here. But I noticed, you might underline it, verse 4, that the glory of the Lord had filled the house. Now, fell on my face. There's that glory that we've been talking about. Look at verse 5. At the end of verse 5, mark well who may enter the house and all who go out from the sanctuary. In other words, Ezekiel, take note of this, mark it down, identify all of those who are allowed to go in and those coming and going within the sanctuary. Now say to the rebellious house of Israel, I'm reading at verse 6, O house of Israel, let us have no more of all your abominations. What had they done? They'd allowed foreigners to come in. When you brought in foreigners, uncircumcised in heart and uncircumcised in the flesh, to be in my sanctuary to defile it. It was because of you and your sin that the foreigners came in. That's not going to happen anymore. Now look at verse 9 to finish that section. Thus says the Lord, no foreigner, uncircumcised of heart, uncircumcised in flesh, shall enter my sanctuary, including any foreigner who is among the children of Israel. Now, if that's a literal description throughout chapters 40 to 48, then circumcision is binding. You say, well, that's symbolic. That's my point. It's symbolic. It is figurative kind of language. Now, let's start at verse 10, the place of the Levites and the priests. Now, I want to get this because I want to get to some other things. Beginning at verse 4, he talks about, and I'm just going to paraphrase down through verse 14, that the Levites were the ones who were at fault and when the people sinned. Now, they were not the only ones. They were the priest, and there were other priests, and then there were the high priest, and then there was the kings and some false prophets. But when you went after your idols, they bear some of the iniquity for that. So in essence, what I'm reading down through verse 14 is these Levites are not going to be allowed to do what they did before. And so they're going to serve, but they're not going to be in the sanctuary serving as they were before. Now let's drop down to verse 15 and look at this last section. The sons of Zadok shall minister to the Lord. They'll be the priest. Now who was Zadok? He was a priest. You have a question in your handout. He was a priest in David's day, 2 Samuel 8. In 1 Chronicles chapter 6, and he was a high priest under the period of Solomon. He was faithful, and that's why Zadok is mentioned here. Not that he's going to be raised from the dead and he'll be the priest, but those that are faithful is the idea. Not like these Levites that he described in 10 to 14. Zadok and his descendants were faithful, so consequently those who are faithful are going to serve. So the sons of Zadok, verses 15 and 16. Talks about their linen garments and the way they would dress, their attire and their general conduct. I want to get ahead to verse 23, and that is their function of teaching and judging. And that is, they're going to teach my people the difference in holy and unholy and unclean and clean. In the kingdom, people are going to understand those distinctions. And so that's what we need to understand, the difference in that which is holy and that which is unholy, that which is clean, that which is unclean. And then, in interest of time, I want to just quickly hit that it talks about their inheritance and their support, etc. But it's picturing in terms of a literal picture of a temple and servants in the temple to describe the Messianic age, as we've talked about. So, with that in mind, I want us to go to this in the time we have left. And so let's fill in those 5 points from Haley. This is from the Messiah of Prophecy and the Messiah on His Throne in his book, as Haley's book on that. Haley made this observation in page 188 of that book, speaking of this period in this prophecy. Said this spiritual order necessitated a new temple or house, a new covenant, a new order of priests, sacrifices, and altar. In highly figurative and symbolic language, Ezekiel described Jehovah's provision for these in the Messianic era. He uses language and figures from the old order to describe parallel figures under the new. And so here is the parallel. He says this temple will be a measured temple. Be measured by the divine standard. Quoting Haley, he said the meticulous measuring of each part indicated that everything related to the spiritual temple under the Messiah must be measured by the divine measuring rod. Nothing essential will be left to human reasoning or judgment. So you walk away from this section of Ezekiel and you get this picture that God's temple today, that's us, is measured by the divine measuring rod. Our time is well spent. It's also a temple that has a wall, chapter 40, a wall that separated the holy from the common. Quoting Haley, the Messiah's holy temple is separated from the profane world by a high, thick wall. There should be no mixture or fellowship between the two. Thirdly, the glory of Jehovah filled the house in the person of Jesus. Jehovah filled the present temple in the person of His Son. This affirms that in Christ, who is the glory and the image of God, that in Him the glory of God fills the present temple, which is the fullness of Christ. Fourth, there is the altar, the spiritual sacrifice. The animal sacrifices in Ezekiel's prophecy of sacrifices are used by metonymy for the spiritual sacrifices of the New Covenant order as described by Paul, Romans 12, the writer of Hebrews, Hebrews 13, and Peter, 1 Peter 2 and verse 5. Priests under the new covenant must be as careful in observing the law of spiritual sacrifice and offering as the worship under the old. This further establishes the point made above that the animal sacrifices of Ezekiel 43 symbolize the spiritual sacrifices offered by and partaken by the spiritual priest at the altar of the Lamb's supreme sacrifice of grace. And then number 5, there's entrance to the house. Chapter 44. Jehovah entered in the person of Jesus, and man enters through the Son, Jesus the Christ. And then there is number 6. I only put 5 blanks, I think, for you, but there's actually 6. The priesthood is only the faithful. The point is that every child of God will be a priest, and only the faithful, the seed of Zadok, will serve. I don't know about you, but that helped me, reading Haley's observations about that. And you want to read more, then I recommend Messiah of Prophecy to the Messiah on the Throne by Homer Haley, where he makes that parallel. With that, we're going to stop, because that's a good stopping place. There's some more that we could say by way of practical things. But we'll stop right there. Chapter 45 and 46 next time.